are drawn together tonight to convene another academic year in which we are all dedicated to accomplishing our educational mission, to challenge minds and be challenged, to inspire souls and be inspired, to support each other in our ongoing search for truth, to prepare and strive to be successful, responsible citizens, and to aspire always to lives of integrity and moral courage. Here to help us reflect on this 189th opening convocation of the college is Dr. Anthony Wilson, an outstanding faculty exemplar of these shared values. Anthony brings to his work a genuine passion for teaching and a servant's heart. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Wilson to the podium.
All right, I always tell my students to name what you write, that titles matter, and so I have a title for my address this evening. It's called The Semester of Silence and the Grocery Store Blues, How Two Failures Taught Me How to Listen to My Students. So the first thing I thought, well, not the first thing I thought, but soon after I won this award, I started thinking about this address, and I thought, what am I going to tell this faculty with all of its achievements about teaching, right? Why should they listen to me? And that kind of reminded me of something actually that my dad had said years earlier. As Dr. McAlexander mentioned, both my parents were English professors. My mom's here tonight. My father passed away some time ago. They're both fantastic English professors. Dad was kind of old school in his approach. He taught mostly big classes at state universities. He was a brilliant lecturer. Students would come in there not particularly caring about Huckleberry Finn or Moby Dick, and they would just be enthralled by what he had to say. Anyway, somebody once asked him, do you ever think about doing more discussion in your classes rather than lecture? Because he was pretty lecture heavy. And he looked at him and said, what are they going to tell me about American literature? I'm sure he was at least half joking with that, right? He wasn't really that kind of an egomaniac. But by the time I started teaching as a woefully underprepared graduate student, a lot closer in age to my students than I was to my dad, I had settled on a very different approach. In my classes, I had decided students would talk and I would listen. This is the first failure, which I call the semester of silence. So as I went through the pretty meager preparation that I got to teach my first freshman writing about literature class, I latched onto this one piece of advice that somebody had probably thrown out casually and never intended anybody to take quite so seriously. Somebody said, don't be afraid of silences. So I took that as kind of my mantra, right? I'm not going to be afraid of silences, and I was not afraid of silences. So my whole first semester, I'd come in, I'd ask a question, and I'd wait. And I'd stand there, and I'd glance at one student who would immediately look at the floor, and then I'd look at another one who would just stare back, and I'd wait. And it just got awful. And eventually, somebody would cave just to get things moving, right, and say something, and I would acknowledge it, and I'd ask another question, and then I'd wait. And I'd think, I'm making them think, right? This is active, student-centered learning that's happening here. This is what's supposed to happen. And it was excruciating, and I would have hated to be a student in my own class. I didn't have that perspective at that point, but I know now how miserable that must have been. My student evals came in after that semester, and they were kind of weirdly, genteelly rough in the way that Vanderbilt students can be. They said things like, really nice guy, but the class just dragged. Another one said, I don't know if it was our fault or his fault, but every day it was just like crickets. And then another one said, he was really sweet, but the class was just painful. And somehow those efforts to be nice just made it worse. Like, bless your heart, you're just terrible at this, right? So here's what I learned from that experience. Ironically, I figured out I hadn't really been listening to my students. Sure, I made them talk, and I listened to what they said, but I wasn't hearing their frustration. As a result, I was a pretty crummy teacher that semester. I wanted them to tell me about literature, the way my dad said they couldn't. But what they needed to tell me was about how and what they were learning. And to do that, they needed me to lead them, to help them along, to steer the conversation and facilitate their participation. They needed guidance and not silence. At the beginning, my students may not be able to tell me much about American literature or film or writing in the abstract. I've been doing this a long time, after all, and they're just starting out. But teaching really isn't about the abstract. I'm not looking for students to tell me something I don't know about William Faulkner, though sometimes they do. I'm listening for students to tell me, consciously or not, about how they're thinking about a story or an idea or an issue, how they're understanding, not understanding, questioning, receiving, processing. So I started to guide my class to rephrase questions, to lead them when they needed more. I started gradually to figure things out, and the more I listened, the better I became at creating environments in which students felt comfortable and appropriate speaking. So before I start patting myself on the back too much, let's get to that second humiliating failure. About that same time in grad school in Nashville, I was in a band called the Wash Jones Blues Project. I played lead guitar, and we were actually pretty good, but this was Nashville, and everybody's pretty good, and everybody you meet is in 4 bands, right? Good gigs were hard to come by. So we played a little bit around town, it was a graduate school band and I, but our steadiest gig was a Sunday morning show in the cafe section of a health food grocery store where a bassist's wife worked. The Sunday morning crowd skewed a little older and didn't show a whole lot of interest in our rockin' blues as they ate their grocery store sushi and vegan lasagna. We were pretty good, but it didn't matter. We could have been the Beatles and it wouldn't have mattered. Our music blended into background noise as cashiers called for price checks and elderly patrons drowned us out with coughing fits. I'd be in the middle of a solo and be interrupted by deli line 2, deli line 2 over the PA system. Sometimes, and this is absolutely true, more than once, customers would come up in the middle of a song to our lead singer and ask for where the canned salmon was or something like that, right? Like, I know you're singing, but I really need to find my groceries and get out. We took requests, and our most frequent request was that we turn it all down a little bit. So here's what I learned from that experience. No matter how good our playing was, it meant nothing if nobody was really hearing it. There wasn't much we could do about it in that case. A gig was a gig. But it did balance out the lesson of the semester of silence. No music, no performance, no lecture is effective if it isn't reaching an audience. The answer to my silence problem in the classroom then wasn't just going to be shifting to full tilt lecture. I had to figure out how to connect. The thing that really made it all start to click, and I'm still waiting for it to click fully, but it started then, was when I stopped thinking of students as my audience and started thinking of the work in the classroom as a continuous conversation. Around the same time as the semester of silence and the grocery store blues, the Vanderbilt student paper published an op-ed titled, "Teacher, Leave Those Kids Alone." Bonus points if you caught the Pink Floyd reference. The author of this piece argued against attendance policies. She said that she, as a paying customer, should be able to make use of what she paid for or not, like buying a gym membership. If I want to spend my time lying out on the lawn with my friends instead of listening to a bunch of stuff about John Stuart Mill, that should be my choice, she said. Now, there are a lot of logical problems with this. First of all, she had every right to lie out on the lawn instead of going to class. She'd just end up failing the class, right? But that wasn't really the point. A fellow English grad student wrote a brilliant response to this piece that's influenced my teaching philosophy ever since. Essentially, he argued against the performer-audience dynamic that I'd been struggling with during my brief career. He argued that the author of the op-ed owed it to her fellow students to show up for class. In fact, her presence in classes was one of the things her fellow students were paying for. She wasn't just there to learn from her professors, a passive consumer of knowledge. She was there to be part of the conversation, to generate that learning that happened in the classroom. And so are you, students. You're here to learn from each other as much as you are to learn from us. And the things you say, the questions you ask, the brilliant insights, even the not-so-brilliant insights, all help your fellow students and your professors to work through texts, ideas, and concepts. You help them learn. This is the kind of learning that can happen at a college like this, where classes tend to be small and intimate enough to enable professors to listen to students and students to listen to each other. You're not just consumers, free to listen to or ignore the band on the stage as you go about your business. You're in the band. Sometimes you'll need to sit and listen. Sometimes you'll need someone to tell you things or explain how things work or show you how to do things. But you're in the band. And ultimately, the measure of my success is not how well I play, but how well you play. And to know that, I have to listen. Thanks.